I don't need to introduce you to The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. You know about the game. You know who had a hand in making it, when it was released, what console it's on, all that.
Talking about Ocarina of Time is not a novel concept. The game has been reviewed and reflected upon to no end.
As of 2022, it's even been recompiled by fans to run natively on PCs.
This game is no stranger to praise.
It's the highest rated game of all time on MetaCritic, and has been forever. People have loved this game since it was first released. I may not have been around for that initial release, but I too came to love this game. 2002
was a big year for my experience with Ocarina of Time. Specifically, it was the year of two key births.
One was little old me, and the other was the release of the Ocarina of Time Master Quest GameCube disc in Japan, which would make its way to America in the following year.
Oddly, I've never actually played through Master Quest. I've never even started it. For my whole life, it's been baked onto this disc, and I've only ever selected it by accident.
I find it strange though to think someone saw the literal best game of all time and thought it needed updates.
From memory, there's nothing in this game that felt subpar.
For a while, OOT was my absolute favorite video game. It's the first game I remember beating entirely on my own, and that's a fact I'm still proud of. Even though it's lost its #1 ranking, it easily clears my top 5.
I'd tell you which game overtook it, but I'm pretty sure I'd lose all credibility before we've even started.
Playing Ocarina of Time on the GameCube felt perfect. I think the GameCube might have one of the best controllers ever, and everything felt so natural and easy to control. They say the best controllers in games work hand in hand to create a seamless play experience, and I definitely felt that on the GameCube.
For this video though, I'm gonna be doing the unthinkable.
I'll be playing OOT on Nintendo Switch Online.
Honestly, I don't know what this video is going to be. I can't say for sure if it'll join the miles-long list of OOT retrospectives, or if it'll be a review of a 26-year-old game, or a weirdly segmented Let's Play / walkthrough, or something entirely different. But I want to make this video regardless.
I want to talk about this game, and I guess I'll figure everything else out along the way. Link begins his journey as a normal Kokiri boy living in the forest among his identically dressed friends and Mido.
Unlike all these children though, Link does not have a fairy guardian to call his own.
This all changes as the Great Deku Tree, the protector of the forest, sends the fairy Navi to retrieve Link. It's revealed the Deku Tree has been cursed, and he has but moments to live. This gets the ball rolling for the adventure with some elevated stakes.
We don't know why the Deku Tree needs us, or why he's been cursed, but we know it's important.
Saria, Link's longtime friend, is happy to see us have a fairy to call our own, but some of the other Kokiri aren't so supportive.
I've played this section of the game countless times, whether it's regular playthroughs on the GameCube or 3DS versions, randomizers, challenge runs, or anything else. I know Kokiri Forest like the back of my hand.
Run to the sword, collect rupees for the shield, prove Mido wrong, and head to the first dungeon of the game.
It's a simple series of steps to teach the player the basic controls they'll need for the entire game.
The main method of instructing the player is through Navi, Link's aforementioned fairy companion. Throughout the game, Navi is used to give hints, help the player with combat through Z-targeting, and as a voice to advance the plot.
Apparently, people don't like Navi.
I don't think I've ever heard a single person explain why, but there's an age-old hatred of Navi and her interruptions.
You'll get an occasional, "Hey, listen," but that doesn't really bother me. Well, that's not entirely true, but it bothers me for a separate reason.
Replaying this first dungeon for the video had me getting a little upset with Navi, but that's because she's giving me tutorials on things I've been doing for 15 years.
It's equivalent to getting a catch tutorial in every Pokemon game, or having to stand in the briefing room before a game of laser tag just to repeat the iconic phrase, "I will not run, jump, or climb!"
The Deku Tree is a simplistic dungeon, but that makes perfect sense since it exists mostly to acquaint the player with the controls and mechanics of the game. The puzzles are simplistic, the enemies aren't too threatening, and the boss of the dungeon, Goma, is taken down with just a few sword swings. Unfortunately, Link's actions were not enough to save the Deku Tree, and he passes away shortly after handing Link the Kokiri's Emerald and giving him some guidance to head towards Hyrule Castle.
After completing the first dungeon, the world really opens up. In general, there are 3 Zelda games credited as true adventures, at least that I've heard about.
The original Legend of Zelda was made to capture Miyamoto's adventures in the forest as a child, and Breath of the Wild sought to take that idea and use modern technology, game design, and other components to amp that feeling past its limits.
Ocarina of Time had the same goal in mind almost 20 years before Breath of the Wild did.
Ocarina of Time's world has things to do, but it always has this forward momentum that Breath of the Wild lacks because of its sheer scale. In Ocarina of Time, I can first enter Hyrule Field and check out Lon Lon Ranch, Kakariko Village, and Zora's River and see the obstacles blocking my path. When I get back on the main trail via Hyrule Castle, I'll see how each of these hurdles can be cleared over time.
It's easy to get lost in the world of Ocarina of Time, but it's never hard to find your way back to the beaten path.
Breath of the Wild really has no beaten path, and I find that a little daunting. You almost have to inspire yourself to continue playing, where Ocarina of Time keeps things focused a little bit more. An encounter with Princess Zelda in Hyrule Castle gives us some more context for the game's story. Essentially, Zelda has been having premonitions of a visitor to the castle named Ganondorf seizing power over all of Hyrule, and she asks Link, who also has appeared in her dreams, to collect the 3 spiritual stones from across the land in order to access the Temple of Time.
We already have the Kokiri's Emerald from the Deku Tree, and it's not long before we discover our next stop.
Zelda's attendant Impa advises Link to head off to Kakariko Village and the adjacent Death Mountain, home of the Gorons.
This is where the next dungeon of the game lies, and I personally think it's among the weaker of the bunch.
The story here is that the Goron race has been locked out of their main supply of rock food, Dodongo's Cavern, because of an influx of monsters and a large boulder blocking the entrance. Darunia, the Goron leader, is grateful when Link offers to go in and clear out the dungeon. Dodongo's Cavern has an interesting concept, but I find its layout to be relatively bland.
When getting excited to replay Ocarina of Time, Dodongo's Cavern is one of the areas I'm less hyped for.
Maybe I'll use the blue demon glitch to levitate up and skip to the end. Dodongo's Cavern is relatively simple in its layout, and the visual design of the cave isn't as interesting to me compared to the Deku Tree's theme or the uniqueness of the next dungeon. The boss of Dodongo's Cavern, King Dodongo, is pretty fun though, and he's a great way to allow players to practice throwing objects. Tossing bombs was required to open this dungeon, and it'll be required after the dungeon's over to allow Link to climb Death Mountain and get magic from the Great Fairy, so there's a clear path of progression here. This dungeon might not be my favorite in terms of aesthetics, but it follows in the Deku Tree's steps of teaching the player how to play the game, this time with a few less specific instructions.
The training wheels are still on, but you're beginning to pedal on your own.
With the Goron's Ruby in hand, and after an attempt at a Darunia-led Goron hug ceremony and a trip to the summit of Death Mountain, it's time to go up Zora's River to Zora's Domain.
Now, I know what to do and how to get through this section of the game, but new players are required to do a little exploration on their own in order to find out where to go.
By talking to the local Zora, you have to learn about the Zora diving minigame, play the game, win the game, then use the newfound Silver Scale to dive into the gate connecting Zora's Domain and Lake Hylia. Then discover the message in a bottle and take the letter to King Zora to discover the next dungeon.
There's some in-game dialogue informing you about all of these things, but it's up to you to put everything together. And if you don't know what this Lake Hylia place is that the fish people are talking about, I guess your only option is to explore.
Which isn't a bad thing. It's good for players to explore the map, uncover all the areas, and see the roadblocks stopping them from progressing.
It's like playing Metroid.
Having a map and knowing what blocks your progress allows you to put one and one together to make two once you have a new item. If you visit Zora's River before helping the Gorons, you'll see boulders blocking the road. Once you get bombs and learn they can blow up rock barriers, you'll know to use them on those and any other obstructing rocks.
I prefer this a lot over the go anywhere, do anything mentality of modern open world games.
I get a bit of decision paralysis playing true open world games because I never know exactly what to do next.
The main advantage that Ocarina of Time has when releasing the player to do a little self-guided exploration is that the world isn't overwhelmingly large.
Once you get the essential items in your pocket, you can begin to see how these areas connect and interact. After figuring out how to get into Jabba Jabu's belly, you're welcomed into what is definitely the strangest dungeon of the game. Moving from the generic lava cave to the literal inner guts of a large fish is a night and day difference in creativity. Here, we're asked to find the Zora Princess Ruto, who has gone missing during one of her Jabba Jabu feeding sessions. Turns out, he swallowed her by accident.
Whoopsies.
I find that Jabba Jabu's belly is a really enjoyable dungeon that expands on what the player is to expect a dungeon to be. The rooms of Jabba Jabu's belly affect one another in a way that small keys will be used in future dungeons. By using the boomerang to sever the wiggly tail thing of one room, another entirely separate room will become accessible. Without directly spelling it out, Ocarina of Time is continuing to subtly teach you things. Once you defeat this dungeon, become engaged to a fish girl, and get the spiritual stone of water, the game takes what may be the most iconic turn in gaming history. While running back to Hyrule Castle, you notice the world darken, and a storm begins to brew in the normally peaceful sky. A cutscene will take over, highlighting just how dire things have gotten in your absence. Zelda and Impa ride away from the castle, desperately fleeing the main villain of the game, Ganondorf. After Zelda throws a mysterious item into the moat around Castletown, Link and Ganondorf meet face to face for the first time. Both the characters and the player don't know this yet, but there's a lot more behind this chance meeting than meets the eye. Ganondorf is cocky, arrogant, and dead set on achieving his goal. Link is brave and stoic, albeit a little naive.
He doesn't understand what his role in the story is yet.
Ganondorf quickly writes Link off as a stupid kid, introducing him to the grass fields of Hyrule with a magic orb attack before riding off after Zelda and Impa. As a player, this moment is tense, and when it's all over, you can't help but feel a little lost and confused.
The whole game up until this point was an errand for Zelda. After getting the spiritual stones, Link and Zelda were to work together to complete the next steps. But she's gone now.
All she left behind is the game's titular instrument, the Ocarina of Time, tossed haphazardly into the moat around the castle. This instrument does come with an additional set of instructions, although they don't clear up the situation much. One thing is clear though.
Link is headed to the Temple of Time.
And it's here where the game completely changes. Setting the spiritual stones in their slots, playing the Song of Time, and approaching the legendary Master Sword causes what may be the biggest jaw-drop moment in the entire Zelda series.
You've only been playing a fraction of the game.
Even though you've gone through 3 dungeons and accumulated a pocket full of items, you've barely scratched the surface of what Ocarina of Time has to offer. Pulling the Master Sword out of its pedestal leads to the Sage of Light, Rauru, revealing that Link's actions have allowed Ganondorf to enter the Sacred Realm, meaning he has claimed the ultimate power and ravaged Hyrule. Without the protection of the 7 sages, nobody was able to stop Ganondorf. It's up to Link to save the sages before taking the fight directly to Ganondorf.
This is a big task, and in order to fill the boots of the Hero of Time, Link had to lie in wait for 7 years before he would be ready to accept the role.
When the camera pans back up to Link, you see he is a completely new man.
Adult Link is taller, stronger, and somehow unable to throw a boomerang or hold a stick.
For some reason, you lose access to some of Child Link's items when you travel through time. It doesn't end up mattering much since you get replacements for everything, but it's a strange little quirk.
As soon as you gain control of Adult Link, a new character named Sheik will interrupt you.
Sheik is freaking cool. Acting as sort of a guide, somewhat of a replacement for the owl that told Child Link where to go, Sheik directs Link to visit the Forest Temple in the Lost Woods, but also tells him to visit Kakariko Village and find an important item there. Leaving the Temple of Time instantly shows what Ganondorf's fury has done to the land you've come to know and love over the first hours of gameplay. Castletown is ruined, and the entire feel of Hyrule is different. Kakariko Village is in tip-top shape though, as all the refugees from Castletown have fled to the adjacent settlement. Not everyone has survived though, as you discover that Dampé the Gravekeeper has passed away, and his ghost now inhabits the labyrinth that is his grave.
I wonder what he did in his life to deserve being buried in the same place where a lab mouse is tested on how fast they can get to their cheese.
Dampé was also buried with the coolest item in Zelda, the hookshot. Grabbing this item allows Link to grapple up to the Forest Temple, which lies on the other side of Hyrule Field, deep in the Lost Woods.
Just like the rest of the world, Kokiri Forest is in a sorry state.
Monsters now roam the lands that just hours ago Link called home.
Ocarina of Time isn't the first Zelda game that has showcased two versions of the same world, but it is the first one where the two worlds are supposed to be one and the same.
A Link to the Past's Dark World was a parallel dimension, something entirely separate from Hyrule.
If Link took a really long nap, the Dark World in Hyrule wouldn't change at all.
In Ocarina of Time, you're looking into the future.
The world is destroyed because of your actions, and only you can prevent forest fires. I mean, the destruction of Hyrule.
The Forest Temple is gatekept by this really dumb moblin maze that, despite my years of experience with Ocarina of Time, I cannot for the life of me get right. The purpose of this maze is to teach you to peek around your corners using the Z targeting feature, but the moblins have such large invincibility cones and massive fields of view that you get caught in cycles of getting poked.
As a dungeon, the Forest Temple definitely isn't my favorite, but I understand why it is the way it is. Let's start with the good and mention the not so good later.
First things first, the design of the dungeon and its music are amazing. Instead of going for a bright arboreal theme, the Forest Temple takes on the appearance of a dark and mysterious mansion in the woods, slowly succumbing to nature's embrace, while still holding on to the remnants of its occupants. I specifically jotted down a note about these candles by the doors, and I stand by them being the quintessential symbol of set building in this dungeon.
And the music, haunting, echoey, strange in its origins, absolutely perfect.
I did have an awful time in this dungeon though. Unlike the Child Link dungeons, this dungeon is far from linear.
I've played through this game dozens and dozens of times, and I somehow still got lost in the Forest Temple.
While I was playing, I was frustrated by how inefficiently I was moving through the temple, but in hindsight, I knew this was a trial by fire of what the rest of the game was going to be. The child dungeons allowed you to grasp the basic concepts, and the adult dungeons put your understanding to the test.
I may not have passed the test in the Forest Temple, but you know I felt fired up to try again during the next dungeon after I cooled off and thought about it for a second.
This dungeon's challenge is to find the 4 ghost sisters, defeat them, and restore the central elevator in order to enter the boss room. To accomplish this, you have to manage a new resource, small keys.
Instead of all the doors in a dungeon being freely open or locked behind room-based challenges, there are locked doors that require you to get a key from an entirely separate area of the temple.
Oftentimes, you have to make a choice where to use a small key once you find one. This breaks up the previously established format of linearity in dungeons.
You can get lost in the adult dungeons, and while you can't get locked out of progressing, you can definitely get confused.
There's no worse feeling than going through a series of rooms on one side of the dungeon to come to a dead end because you don't have a key, then looking at the map and seeing the only unopened chests are on the opposite side.
Speaking of exploring the dungeon, there's a lot of cool stuff to find here.
The dungeon item for the Forest Temple is the Fairy Bow, and it quickly becomes one of your most used items for puzzles and combat. You'll use it to light torches from a distance, activate switches, and to battle 3 of the 4 ghosts.
Here's a fun little fact about the last ghost you battle.
Unlike the first 2 that hide in paintings, the purple ghost named Meg creates duplicates of herself to trick Link. The real Meg spawns 1 frame before the 3 duplicates, so if you're paying extra close attention, you can tell which one is which before she does her little spin move.
This dungeon's boss is really cool too.
Upon entering an empty portrait room, you'll attempt to leave, but be stopped by the exit gate snapping shut. Ganondorf will appear and taunt you before it's revealed that you're not facing the King of Evil, merely his puppet. This fight is just a taste of what's to come, and it's great. You get some action with the bow during the first phase, and once Phantom Ganon hops off his horse, you get to play a little ping pong.
Remember this for later, because it's important for something in the long run.
After beating the boss, you discover that this dungeon's sage is Saria, Link's childhood friend.
Just like Link, her role in Hyrule's fate is much deeper than originally thought, and she nobly accepts her place as the sage of the Forest Temple.
After exiting the temple, a new Deku Tree Sproutling pops up and talks to Link about his origins. Unlike the rest of the Kokiri, Link has aged. This is because Link is not actually a Kokiri, but a Hylian who was placed under the care of the Deku Tree after the passing of Link's mother.
In the grand scheme of things, this doesn't matter too much, but it does show how great heroes can come from seemingly humble beginnings.
And with that, it's back to the Temple of Time to update Sheik on our progress. As a reward for showing your heroism through saving the first sage, Sheik teaches you a song that lets you teleport to the Temple of Time at will, and allows you to access the Master Sword's pedestal to return to the Child Era whenever you want. Sheik also vaguely hints that your next two conquests lie in a mountain and a lake. Mirroring the dungeon order from the first part of the game, Link heads to Death Mountain to find the next sage. When entering Goron City to reunite with all our Goron friends, we find that the city is nearly empty. With the exception of one very small rolling Goron, replacing the previously very large rolling Goron, there's nobody here.
Just like with Kokiri Village, using a familiar setting from the Child Link era with an entirely new context creates a feeling of sorrow and unrest. At this point, you don't know what's wrong, but it's apparent that something is wrong, and you're fired up to fix it.
And it doesn't take long to discover what that issue is. After politely asking the little rolling Goron to pause his exercise for a catch-up conversation, you learn that he is the son of Darunia, and that all the Gorons were captured when Ganondorf revived the long-deceased fire dragon Volvagia, who was held up in the Fire Temple.
Darunia went in to save his people, but things are looking grim because he doesn't have the legendary hammer used to defeat Volvagia's original incarnation.
The little Goron, who's named after the player since Darunia respects you so much, asks you to save the Goron race. After giving you a fire-resistant tunic and some advice on how to find the Fire Temple, the little Goron sends Link on his way towards the next dungeon.
In general, I have less things to say about the Fire Temple than I do about the Forest Temple, but that doesn't mean the dungeon is automatically good or bad. In fact, I'd place it somewhere in the middle.
I think the Fire Temple is a lot easier than the Forest Temple, both in the sense that it's harder to get lost or do things out of order, but also because the dungeon's concept is far more streamlined. Within the first few minutes of entering the dungeon, Link and Darunia will meet up and exchange a few words about what the overarching goal of the dungeon is. While Darunia tries his best to fend off Volvagia, despite not having the legendary hammer, Link is tasked with finding and freeing the caged Gorons before they can become dragon food. The most in-depth this concept gets is asking yourself, how do I reach that switch? When seeing a Goron locked in a cage.
This leads to the dungeon being far more uneventful than the Forest Temple, but that's not inherently a bad thing. There's a lot of good, fun things in the Fire Temple, alongside some bland bits.
Let's start with the misses. For one, this dungeon reuses the same mini-boss twice in fairly quick succession. The Fire Dancer is a pretty aesthetically pleasing boss, but the fight itself is fairly shallow. All you do is wait for them to stop running, toss a bomb, smack them a bit, then repeat the process until they explode.
It's a bit of a waiting game, and only a few minutes after the first encounter, the mini-boss reincarnates and you run the whole thing back.
The dungeon item you get doesn't change the encounter in any way, so I really don't see why they'd copy and paste the same fight in the same dungeon.
The dungeon item I mentioned is freaking awesome though. If it wasn't obvious from Darunia's whole "I don't have the legendary hammer" speech, the Fire Temple's dungeon item is the Megaton Hammer.
This two-handed weapon can be used as a main melee weapon, but it's better used as a complement to the Master Sword instead of a replacement. Being a heavy weapon, the Megaton Hammer is mostly used in this dungeon for dislodging stuck platforms and pounding down rusted switches, but it also has uses in combat, such as how you can flip over torch slugs before finishing the fight with your sword.
It has some uses out in the field as well.
It can crumble bombable objects if you're out of explosives,
And it can be used as a melee weapon, if you ever can't use your sword for some reason.
Volvagia is also a super fun boss. The fight is decently straightforward, and I definitely didn't die on my first attempt through it, in case you were wondering. When Volvagia pokes his head out from the lava pits, you first weaken him with the hammer, then go in with the sword. In between head pokes, Volvagia will fly around the arena spitting fire and dropping boulders, but all these attacks are easily avoided by hanging on to the side of the battle arena. Once the boss is defeated, Link is teleported to the Chamber of the Sages, where it is revealed that Darunia is the Sage of Fire. Darunia and Link share a heartfelt moment about what it means to be brothers, before Link is returned to the world of Hyrule. The interpersonal side of this game's story is one aspect that I'm especially appreciating during this replaythrough.
When playing through Ocarina of Time originally, I really liked the gameplay and the action and all that, but I never really took the time to feel the deeper impact of the story and the characters that build it.
There are real relationships being developed between the NPCs, Link, and the player, so seeing and helping out people we first met in the Child Era really feels like reconnecting with an old friend.
Any game can have fun gameplay, but for a game to have the reputation that Ocarina of Time does, there has to be more in the proverbial soup. Or should I say proverbial lake? Sheik did say the next dungeon will be under a lake after all.
Navi will hint to you that there's a cold wind coming from Zora's River, and following that hunch all the way will lead Link to the frozen over Zora's domain. Similar to Goron City, all of the characters we met as Child Link are gone, except for King Zora, who has a crystal of red ice encasing him.
Ganondorf has manipulated another location we know and love, and it's time to fix it.
You'll have to do a little bit of independent investigation to find the next objective though. I think the thought process is that after seeing the frozen King Zora, you'll want to check up on Jabu Jabu, and you'll discover that he's been replaced by a series of ice platforms. Hopping from platform to platform will land you right outside the ice cavern, but there's no direct marker or hint to go there.
I think this is a nice balance of hand-holding and open-world exploration.
The ice cavern is a really fun mini dungeon, but I'm glad it's just that. Slipping and sliding around on ice is fun for a second, but if there was a full-length dungeon themed around ice, the mechanic would definitely outstay its welcome.
There's evidence that the forest and water temples were originally the wind and ice temples, with the wind motif being mostly scrapped and the ice motif being reused for the ice cavern, so I'm happy that we only got a small dose of ice.
Throughout the cavern, you'll be navigating the icy floors and carrying bottles of blue fire to melt the red ice blocking your path.
If I were designing this part of the game, I'd probably have the Megaton hammer be enchanted or doused in the blue fire, and have it serve as the means of breaking red ice, instead of relying on a bottle item.
During this playthrough, I skipped a lot of optional stuff, so I only had one bottle and had to make a couple of trips back to the blue fire source to melt all the red ice walls. There's no real boss of the ice cavern, but after fighting a white wolfos in the last room, you'll get the iron boots, and Sheik will teach you the Serenade of Water to teleport to the water temple.
I've got some things to say about the iron boots, but I'll hold off for now.
The main thing you need to know is that when you equip the boots through the equipment pause menu, you can sink to the bottom of bodies of water. That mechanic will be essential in completing the water temple.
But don't teleport there just yet.
Melting King Zora will result in him giving you the Zora tunic, which allows you to breathe underwater.
This isn't a necessary thing, since you'll have enough health to handle holding your breath in the water temple without too much worry, but it's a nice item to have regardless.
With that item in hand, it's now time to head to Lake Hylia's water temple, a dungeon widely regarded as one of the worst in the entire Zelda series.
Now, I want to make it abundantly clear that I went into the water temple with a wide open mind. When I was younger and basically had an Ocarina of Time walkthrough memorized, I thought the water temple was vastly overhated. As a full-grown adult with decades of gaming experience under his belt, I can confidently say that, without a shadow of a doubt, the water temple is 100% not hated enough and should be hated more.
The worst part is, I'm only partially kidding.
I think the water temple is the most confusing, least streamlined dungeon in the whole game, and if you miss one step on the path to completing it, you basically have to reset it.
Because the gimmick of this dungeon is raising the water level progressively from the first to the third floor, there's really no way to backtrack without lowering the water back to the first floor. By that, I mean you'll find yourself raising the water from the bottom to the top, just for you to realize the next room you need to go into is on the middle level. So you're forced to go lower the water back to the bottom, then raise it to the middle, just to get back on track. In addition to managing the water level, you're going to need to swap in and out of the iron boots fairly frequently throughout the dungeon, especially if you don't know exactly what to do.
This really doesn't bother me in all honesty. I know a lot of players despise having to pause the game, and in the Ocarina of Time 3D remake, they made the iron boots a regular item, so you can toggle them on and off with just the push of a button, but the pause menu didn't grate on me too much.
My biggest complaint with the dungeon isn't the boots or the water raising mechanics, it's the layout of the dungeon itself.
Being able to go through 3 separate doors on one wing of one floor of the dungeon, just to discover a locked door, and the only small key being on a completely different wing on a different floor, is so frustrating. And it happened to me several times throughout the dungeon.
Forgetting something on the right side of level 1 that you need on the left side of level 3 is so annoying.
I also think this dungeon is visually boring, but that's not something I was thinking in the moment.
The blue bricks and tiles for the walls and floors definitely make sense, but with other water dungeons in mind, such as Great Bay Temple's mechanical theme, I think there could have been more thought put into the design. The Forest Temple is a mansion in the woods. The Fire Temple is a prison complex of some sort that exists in the crater of an active volcano.
And the Water Temple is a temple full of water. I'm not entirely sure what they were going for.
Unfortunately, the bosses and dungeon item aren't top tier either. In this temple, you'll get an upgrade to the hook shot called the long shot. It's exactly the same item, except it extends twice as long.
Don't get me wrong, this upgrade is useful, but it shouldn't be the crux of an entire dungeon.
The functionality of the item doesn't change, so at the end of the day, you're still grappling onto targets.
It's not game changing, and it's nobody's favorite item. If you say your favorite item is the long shot, your favorite item is actually the hook shot.
The mini-boss of the Water Temple is Dark Link, which is incredibly cool in concept, but awful in execution. Fighting your own shadow, an entity that mirrors your every move and knows your strengths and weaknesses, is freaking awesome.
But I didn't feel those ideas coming through in the actual encounter.
Dark Link copies your attacks, dodges most of your items, and pretty much makes up the rules for the fight. Bombs, the bow, the Megaton hammer, the spin attack, the forward thrust, the jump attack, and most other things you could think of are parried or dodged by Dark Link. After losing in a straight up sword fight, I spammed Din's Fire until I ran out of magic, then got lucky with my sword to land the last few hits.
By completing a lengthy side quest, you can get a two-handed sword that completely obliterates Dark Link, but that isn't fun either. The game needed to meet somewhere in the middle.
If I wanted a cinematic, picturesque sword fight, I'd want to go against Astalfos. They're more acrobatic than Dark Link, and that makes the fight far more interesting.
Playing rock, paper, scissors against your shadow to see whose attack will land isn't my idea of an eventful mini-boss fight.
Morpha, the dungeon's actual boss, is the opposite of Dark Link. Instead of it being overly complex, you can beat Morpha in a single cycle without thinking too much about it.
By manipulating the water it lives in, Morpha's fight is supposed to be a series of evasive maneuvers before you can hookshot the boss out of the water and deal damage to it. That doesn't happen though.
It's really easy and way too tempting to snag Morpha, repeatedly hookshot it until it's in the corner of the room, then hit it until the boss fight is over. No glitches required, No precise timing, just get the ball in the corner and press B. I think this boss might be the quickest one in the entire game, Goma included.
At the top of this segment, I didn't give you any clues on who the sage could be. Can you figure it out? Where is Elmo's favorite candy? Can you see where Dora is hiding? Why am I talking like this is a children's show?
The sage is Princess Ruto.
Princess Ruto was also known as Link's fiancée from when he was 10, and the only named Zora in the entire game.
At the start of the dungeon, Ruto says that Sheik saved her from the frozen Zora's domain, and that by defeating Morpha, Lake Hylia and Zora's domain will return to normal. Lake Hylia does indeed return to its original state, but Zora's domain never thaws.
Ruto even mentions it will unfreeze during her I'm a Sage speech, but that doesn't come true. Oh well.
The water temple is over, and we're officially in the latter half of the Sages and Medallion hunt.
There's no solid direction given for the next bit of the game, and our quest will include a mini-dungeon that's technically optional.
The only hint Navi gives is that it would be wise to find someone who knows about the Sages.
I guess the thought process is that Kakariko Village is basically the only inhabited town in the world, so chances are someone who knows about the Sages is going to live there.
Upon entering Kakariko, you do encounter someone who knows about the Sages, but they don't do much speaking.
Instead, they get rocked by a smoke monster.
Sheik is standing outside the Kakariko village well, and he urges Link to stay back. He is promptly obliterated by some airborne particulates, Link soon follows, and Kakariko village presumably burns to the ground. In the next shot, the town is completely unscathed, the village residents do not care one iota about it, and the overall scene is fairly consequence-free. During Link's recovery from smoke inhalation, Sheik reveals that Impa, Zelda's caretaker from the Child timeline, is the Sage of Shadow, and will need to follow her into the Shadow Temple by playing the Nocturne of Shadow, the newest song we've learned.
Have I said Shadow enough yet, or should I talk about Keanu's hedgehog guy for a minute?
Our next destination is not the Shadow Temple though. While the Shadow Temple, and technically the rest of the game, are beatable without completing the next mini-dungeon, it's not recommended to skip the short detour.
I will say that the next dungeon is incredibly hard to find. Without knowing what to do, I have no clue how you'd figure it out.
Here's a breakdown of what we know for sure. 1. The smoke monster that attacked Sheik and Link came from the Kakariko well. 2. Navi shouts at you to investigate the Kakariko well. 3. The Kakariko well is blocked as an adult.
From these facts, and maybe a few others that I'm missing,
you're supposed to know to enter the windmill, talk to the windmill guy, pull out your ocarina so it'll teach you the Song of Storms, go back in time, return to Kakariko as a child, play the windmill guy the Song of Storms, then enter the bottom of the well mini-dungeon.
Honestly, if you can get into the windmill and learn the ocarina song, you'll be set since the windmill guy rages about how a kid 7 years ago screwed up the windmill, but just getting there from how little the game gives you feels like quite the trial.
This does mark the first time we're placing the Master Sword back in its pedestal to return to the Child timeline, and that's pretty cool. There's a surreal feeling that comes with seeing Castletown completely restored, Kakariko Village still under construction, and everything else being right in the world when you know it's all going to crumble in due time.
Part of it may be your fault.
Well, technically all of it is your fault, since opening the door of time and pulling the Master Sword was what allowed Ganondorf to enter the Sacred Realm, but forget about that for now. I need a segue to talk about the Paradox of Storms. So, adult Link learns the Song of Storms from the Windmill Man, and the Windmill Man heard it from a troublesome child who played it 7 years ago and messed things up, yeah? Well, you go back in time 7 years to become said troublesome child who screws up the windmill, so who invented the Song of Storms? Where did it come from originally? As I said earlier, playing the Song of Storms as Child Link grants you access to the bottom of the well.
Endearingly abbreviated BOTW, which would go on to become the acronym for the best-selling game in the entire series, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild.
The objective of this mini-dungeon, as the walls so kindly tell you, is to find the Eye of Truth. At first, you'll be walking around, falling through the floor, and phasing through walls on your quest to figure out exactly what's going on here. While stumbling around, you'll eventually find yourself in Dead Hand's room, who guards the key reward for the well.
Like the Water Temple, Dead Hand is also widely known and accepted in the community as having impacted millions of children's lives.
In this case, it's because Dead Hand is the scariest thing to grace a kid's TV screen since the Skeksis from Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal. Just like the Water Temple, child me disagrees, and in this case, so does adult me.
I'll say it. Dead Hand isn't that scary.
I can agree that Dead Hand is quite the tonal shift for the game, and it wouldn't be out of place in an early installment of Resident Evil, but it also kind of looks like Squidward in that one episode of SpongeBob where he gets dipped in the concrete, so there's that.
If Dead Hand had some sort of introduction, like if you caught glimpses of him here and there throughout the well to build tension, or if it had a scream like the Redeads, then I think it could be a contender for spooky.
As it stands, Dead Hand is way too one-dimensional to be scary, at least to me. The fight is also pretty easy too. Get grabbed a few times, break free, then slash away when Dead Hand lowers his head to snack on Link. After a few rounds of that, you'll defeat the monster that looks like a ball of clay, and you'll earn the Lens of Truth.
When using the Lens of Truth, you'll see through any illusions present in your line of sight.
That means if you retrace your steps through the bottom of the well, you can equip the Lens of Truth and see why you were falling through the floor or clipping through walls.
Turns out, it wasn't because Nintendo lacks quality control. Who would have thought?
there's quite a bit more to do in the well if you choose to stick around longer. I think extra goodies like this are neat, even if I didn't chase after them in this playthrough.
The bottom of the well is a quick, simple mini dungeon that gives a taste of what's to come in the Shadow Temple.
I do wish it was a little easier to find, since Lens of Truth is really important for a new player to have, but it's possible I'm missing an obvious hint somewhere in the game.
Relating the bottom of the well to Ocarina of Time as a whole, the sense of self-driven adventure running in parallel with the developers having you do the things they want you to do goes a long way in explaining why people love this game. Even when the game is linear, there are nooks and crannies to get distracted with.
I haven't mentioned any of them yet, and I didn't do any in this playthrough, but there's an extra weapon to get, 100 gold Skulltula spider tokens to find, pieces of heart to bolster your health bar, a noble steed to learn to ride, and a ton of minigames to play for various rewards and upgrades.
Zelda games have always had these, but Ocarina of Times were unlike any other. Not just because the world was in 3D, but also in the depth and complexity behind things.
There's basically half of the bottom of the well left, and it's solely to get gold Skulltula tokens.
I can't accurately explain how large yet controlled the world of Ocarina of Time feels. You're never lost, just misplaced.
Speaking of getting distracted, let's focus back up on our main objective. With the Lens of Truth in hand, we now have everything we need to go into the Shadow Temple by returning to the adult timeline and playing the Nocturne of Shadow.
This segment is going to be a lot shorter than the other dungeon overviews, because I don't have much to say about the Shadow Temple. I think it's a good dungeon, but it's definitely the most simplistic one of them all. It does come with the best boss in the entire game though, so things balance out to somewhere in the middle.
The first thing you'll notice about the Shadow Temple is that you're constantly reminded how dark and disturbing and twisted the dungeon is, mostly through the walls literally telling you to feel put off.
I don't think the Shadow Temple nails the ambiance it was going for, but it did have some good ideas, especially near the beginning of the dungeon.
Mentally, I split the dungeon into two segments, the pre-dungeon item part and the rest of it. Before you get the dungeon special item, you'll be in a very tight catacomb-like area that is reminiscent of a burial ground. And I really like the idea of Hyrule's royal family being politically corrupt and hiding all their demons in a sealed chamber of the graveyard.
But the game ditches that concept after a handful of rooms.
Beyond the first area, the Shadow Temple opens up into a much larger, cavern-like area with no real theme tying everything together.
I really would have liked the game to delve deeper into the question of the royal family's morals and potentially shady past.
But we'll have to settle for a single dead hand fight, and the walls repeatedly telling us we need the Lens of Truth, and a pair of boots that let you temporarily walk on air to tide you over. The hover boots function as the polar opposite to the iron boots we used in the last dungeon, but they're equipped the same way. Thankfully, we need the hover boots far less than we did the iron boots.
You can obviously use them a lot if you find yourself slipping off the edge too much, but they're not required for most of the dungeon. And when the game does want you to use them in a creative way, it spells it out for you.
In execution, the Lens of Truth is more of a dungeon item than the hover boots are, since you'll constantly be looking through the lens to see false walls, hidden chests, or invisible threats. I think they could have utilized the hover boots more, and in more unique ways.
Maybe the boots make you light enough to walk on switches without activating them. Or what if they allowed you to walk quieter to avoid sound-based enemies? Just a few ideas off the cuff.
There's not a whole lot going on for most of the dungeon. I like how straightforward the dungeon is, especially coming off the heels of the Water Temple, but as a result, there's not many specifics to talk about.
The room where you get the boss key is worth mentioning though.
Before entering the Shadow Temple, the game checks if you have Din's Fire by requiring you to light a circle of torches. Near the end of the dungeon, Link is threatened by a wooden set of spikes slowly closing in on him, and Din's Fire is the only way to deactivate the trap.
More quick little puzzles like that could have been used to keep you on your toes throughout the dungeon, furthering the idea that the people who built the Shadow Temple are desperate to keep you out and their secrets in.
And the boss of the Shadow Temple is one of its best kept secrets. Bongo Bongo is a two-handed, one-eyed Omega monster that has the most fun fight in the entire game. I hope that's not a hot take. As Bongo Bongo pounds on the drum-like arena the fight takes place in, Link is tasked with dodging its swiping hands and tackle attacks while simultaneously aiming the bow to shoot the boss's weak points, namely the two hands. Once the hands are stunned, Bongo Bongo will open its eye, and it too can be stunned so damage can be dealt. The fight is chaotic, but there's plenty of room to maneuver.
Honestly, I wish the fight lasted a little longer. Bongo Bongo for best boss of Ocarina of Time.
Once the fun draws to a close, Link meets up with Impa in the Chamber of Sages, and she gives him a rundown on everything she knows about the Sheikah tribe, Zelda's escape from Hyrule Castle, and Ganondorf's plan. We also learn a little about how quickly Hyrule Castle and its troops fell, which feels like it could have been tied into a royal family corruption side plot.
Alright, I won't mention my OOT political thriller fanfiction anymore. But you'll tell me if you want to read it, right?
Impa's speech hints at some deeper lore that a modern game would probably spend minutes of cutscenes on, but Ocarina of Time is confident in its story, so the Sheikahs and their role in Hyrule aren't overly explained. In reality, their existence only matters to us to explain why Impa is a sage and why Sheik, who I guess is named after his entire tribe, is so dang cool. Despite her infinite wisdom, Impa does not give us a hint towards the location of the final dungeon and medallion.
We get that information from Navi, who tells you to explore the desert, a place you probably haven't been to yet.
Child Link can do very few things inside the desert, so it's not a place we have ties to. The desert is essentially an adult Link only area, which means the game's approach so far of having adult Link work alongside a friendly character from the Child Link era will have to change. What doesn't change, thankfully, is the game's killer soundtrack.
I've given props to a few songs so far, but in reality, every song in the game is really good.
In my opinion, the Gerudo Valley theme takes the cake as the best song on the soundtrack. It's upbeat, energetic, and sets the mood for one of the best stretches of the game.
I should explain Gerudo Valley as an environment before we go any further.
The valley is home to the Gerudo, a race of women thieves who live an isolationist lifestyle. Every century, a man is born in their clan, and he becomes the de facto leader.
This cycle, Ganondorf was the man. As a result, the Gerudo shun all outsiders, especially men.
Foolishly, 4 carpenters have ventured into the Gerudo's fortress to learn their ways of thievery, and they've subsequently been captured. Before Link can progress to the next temple, he must earn the Gerudo's trust.
This is done through the best mini-dungeon / combat challenge the game has to offer.
All while avoiding being spotted and detained by the patrolling Gerudo guards, Link has to maneuver through the Gerudo fortress grounds to find and free the imprisoned carpenters. Once a carpenter is found, a Gerudo thief will drop down and engage in a sword fight with Link.
On a scale from Dark Link to Stalfos, the Gerudos are far closer to a Stalfos encounter, so the fight is actually fun.
Your health bar doesn't really matter in this fight, because if a thief is able to land a few hits on you, you're immediately captured and you have to start sneaking through the fortress again.
I really like this area, and I wish the devs would have done a little more with it.
In future Zelda games, we see similar stealth areas, but in those games, Link has all of his items taken, and he has to recover them all one by one.
Using that concept here would have been really cool.
As it stands, Gerudo Fortress is still a blast though. The fights against the thieves are action-packed, and you're always on the edge of your seat for another one.
That's the main reason why I wish it was a longer challenge.
When it's done, the second-in-command thief will give you the Gerudo's membership card, which stops you from being detained and allows you to participate in the area's minigames, the archery range, and the training grounds. The archery range is exactly what it sounds like, and the training grounds are completely optional mini-dungeon that tests the knowledge and abilities you've learned throughout the entire game.
It's a true endgame challenge.
The membership card also allows you to access the Haunted Wasteland, which serves as the final trial before you get access to the Spirit Temple. According to the other thief, the Gerudo leader Nabooru runs the clan out of the Spirit Temple, which lies beyond the permanently storming desert and invisible maze.
I'm not entirely sure how she gets anything done when there are such impossible trials between her and her clan, but go off, Nabooru.
The first challenge in the Haunted Wasteland is a quicksand river that you need to hookshot across, and the second challenge is to follow markers through an invisible maze. During the first stretch, you'll be following flagpoles, and in the latter half, you'll be using the Lens of Truth to follow a ghost guide.
Technically, you can run through the maze without following the ghost if you know the exact path, but a first-time player will have a near impossible time doing so.
Even though it's difficult, it is doable, so the Lens of Truth remains an optional item.
You're better off picking it up though.
My only gripe with this area of the game, besides the fact that I wish it was longer, is the constant storm of lever enemies that take pot shots at you as you're following the ghost. Since you can't use your powered up spin attack while using another magic consuming item, you'll have a wicked hard time hitting the levers before they get out of range and hide in the sand.
Seriously, those guys suck.
The Gerudo Valley and desert areas are some of the best in the entire game. They boast original ideas, kickin' music, and a unique story to discover as adult Link.
After getting used to the formula of helping out friends we met as Child Link, the Shadow Temple steps a bit away from that, and the Spirit Temple dives headfirst into something completely new.
Even hours and hours into the game, Ocarina of Time is still surprising you with new and exciting developments. A short jaunt through the sand later, and we've arrived at the Spirit Temple's grounds. Upon entering, you discover a very small opening room with a large block to the right and a small passageway to the left. There's nothing we can do at the moment, but leaving the temple results in Sheik teaching Link the Requiem of Spirit and instructing him to come back as a child to begin the dungeon.
The concept of a child-adult combo dungeon isn't used super well, but despite that, the Spirit Temple has a lot of good things going for it.
For one, the design of the temple is fantastic. I still like the Forest Temple's theming more, but the Spirit Temple does an excellent job of feeling like an Indiana Jones-esque archaeological expedition in a sand-swept tomb. There's parts of the dungeon that are weathered by the elements, but there are still elegant pieces that remain in good condition.
I'm not entirely sure what a Spirit Temple even is, but I'm positive that this is it.
The child-adult split is interesting, but like I said, I feel like it could have been expanded upon. For the most part, you'll do the child section of the dungeon, then the adult section, but it would have been cool if these two parts interacted more.
I don't think having to switch back and forth at the Temple of Time would have been fun, but doing things in the child side that directly affect the adult side of the dungeon, and having to solve a puzzle or two across time, would have been a real thinker.
This dungeon is all about puzzles, far more than the previous dungeons were. You've got Silver Ruby puzzles, Anubis statue puzzles where you have to figure out how to path the enemy into fire, and light reflection puzzles where you're moving mirrors to reflect the sun.
Before you can get to all that though, you have to get a quick rundown from Nabooru.
In order to stick it to Ganondorf, Nabooru plans on robbing the Spirit Temple, which apparently is both her base of operations and Ganondorf's. but she needs the silver gauntlets from the child side of the dungeon in order to make her plan a success. Your task as Child Link is to get those gauntlets and bring them to her. In the meantime, she'll stand around the first room of the dungeon.
Clearly, she's hard at work.
The child side of the dungeon is pretty difficult, mostly because Child Link's equipment is so bad compared to Adult Link's.
After hours of Adult Link gameplay, and the enemies in this dungeon being catered to Adult Link, Child Link really struggles to hold his own.
Stalfos, Lizalfos, and a new enemy called the Iron Knuckle stand between Child Link and his goals, and they're tough fights. Either that, or I suck at Ocarina of Time.
Truthfully, the more I play, the more I think that's true. I'm really bad at Ocarina.
No matter how bad I am though, the Iron Knuckle mini-boss is the most epic melee fight we've seen so far. The fight is even better as Adult Link since you're fighting an enemy your own size, but you get the first taste of it near the end of the child segment.
I'll talk more about Iron Knuckles later.
Once the fight's over, Link steps outside, claims the silver gauntlets, and witnesses the setup for the second half of the dungeon. Nibiru's screams echo through the desert air, and Link glances over just in time to witness Kume and Kotake, also known as the Sorceress Sisters Twinrova, casting a spell to kidnap and brainwash the leader of the Gerudo. This makes no sense, because when completing the Gerudo's fortress area of the game, we're told that Nibiru leads the thieves from her headquarters at the Spirit Temple, but she can't lead them if 7 years ago she was taken by Twinrova.
Maybe it's another paradox thing, like Link's actions caused her to get kidnapped, and if he didn't act, then she wouldn't get kidnapped and therefore could lead the thieves from the Spirit Temple, but that's not how the Song of Storms paradox worked, so I'm guessing the writing team just freestyled a bit here.
The kidnapping is a pivotal scene though, and once all is said and done, the Spirit Temple lies as vacant as the desert separating it from the rest of civilization. The only thing we can do is return to the adult timeline with the silver gauntlets in hand to progress into the other wing of the dungeon.
This side of the dungeon has some of the best gameplay that Ocarina of Time has to offer.
Using the silver gauntlets, Link can push large blocks into place, which is required to access the unexplored side of the dungeon. Even though the gauntlets are an item obtained in a dungeon that enable the dungeon to be explored further, I don't count them as the dungeon item.
There's not much you can do with them beyond their single use, and to put them in the same class as something like the bow just feels wrong.
Thankfully, there's a second dungeon item on the adult side. Another Iron Knuckle stands between Link and the next item we'll add to our collection.
Now that we're on par with the Iron Knuckle, it's a better time to talk about them.
Each Iron Knuckle fight has 2 stages, a slow, tank-like first stage and a more agile, aggressive second stage. The strategy across both stages is to poke the enemy after they swing their axe, then back up to avoid a counterattack. You can also go for a double poke or a jump attack, but the consequences of messing up the timing are dire. The Iron Knuckle hits for 4 hearts and sends Link flying on contact, which is a nerve-wracking sight to see. When the Iron Knuckle's outermost layer of armor is knocked off, the enemy picks up speed, and the fight gets even more intense.
Even compared to a Stalfos encounter, the Iron Knuckles fight feels more like a medieval knight versus knight fight than anything else in the game.
All I can think about is how Dark Link's fight felt nowhere near as exciting as this. By beating the second Iron Knuckle of the dungeon, Link is rewarded with the Mirror Shield, which I consider to be the true dungeon item of the Spirit Temple. The main thing the shield is used for in this dungeon is to reflect sunlight onto different sun icons for puzzles. It's also used later on to reflect and absorb elemental attacks, which I wish would have been a regular feature of the shield.
Being able to reflect any and all magic would have made the Mirror Shield even better. In its current state, the Mirror Shield and the Hylian Shield are basically the same thing in normal combat.
Continuing through the Spirit Temple, Link will use his new shield to solve more puzzles and eventually find himself entering the boss room of Twinrova. Before we can burn the witches, there's a third Iron Knuckle to battle. This one is different though, as when you knock off its outer armor, you discover that it's Nibiru under the mask. For 7 long years, Nibiru has been the servant of Twinrova, doing their cruel bidding, or just sitting on a chair the whole time. It would have been really cool to see Nibiru the Iron Knuckle throughout the entire game, only to learn later down the line that you were the cause of her servitude to Ganondorf.
Even without that addition, this fight serves as the gutting conclusion of Nibiru's story in Hyrule.
At this point, Twinrova snaps her away, and we never see her corporeal form again. We'll see her in the Chamber of Sages though.
Spoiler alert!
Twinrova, both as characters and as bosses to fight, are awesome. These witches met when they were assigned as roommates while attending Shiz, and everything in their lives changed when one decided to help the other become accepted in— oh wait.
Wrong set of witches.
Twinrova are actually the adoptive mothers of Ganondorf, who act as some of his most loyal minions. Sporting fire and ice magic, you'll first battle the two as separate entities, reflecting one's magic against the other to damage them. In the second phase, the witches will combine into one wickedly powerful being that can shoot both types of magic. Here, you'll need to absorb 3 of the same magic attacks without combining fire and ice in order to stun Twinrova before you can attack her. Phase 1 of the fight is really tricky, because Kume and Kotake move separately from one another, and it can be really hard to aim your reflected magic beam to hit the other witch. Phase 2 is a lot easier, because you only have one enemy you need to target, and locking on with Z is an effective means of making sure your absorbed magic attacks land.
Being able to charge your shield with a magic attack is a neat mechanic, and it would have been cool if the Mirror Shield could have been powered up into the Fire or Ice Mirror Shield permanently, with different effects being applied based on whichever one you pick.
Think the blue and red tunics from Link's Awakening, but on a shield instead of clothes.
In general, the entire fight is good, but the second phase is a lot less frustrating than the first phase can be.
I whiffed those reflected beams so many times.
And, again, maybe I'm just bad at Ocarina, but gosh was I getting peeved.
Finally making it to the second phase and being able to just wail on the boss was so rewarding. When the fight is over, Link steps through the blue portal to speak to the 6th sage, Nabooru. Eager to help free the world from Ganondorf's influence, Nabooru is more than willing to help Link from the Chamber of Sages. She also hits on Link, saying something to the effect of how she never imagined the kid she asked for help in the Spirit Temple would grow up into the man before her, and that's a little weird.
Because she's a new character to us, her sagehood doesn't have that much of a personal impact to it, but that doesn't really matter because she's the last sage, and that means we're ready to take the fight to Ganondorf.
Rauru will chime in, telling Link to head to the Temple of Time in order to meet the final 7th sage, whose abilities are necessary to take the fight to the King of Evil.
A lot of story stuff is summarized in this next bit of gameplay, so I'll go through it quickly so we can get to Ganon's castle.
The biggest reveal we'll get is that Zelda was Sheik the entire time. For 7 years, Zelda has been disguised as Sheik to conceal herself from Ganondorf's dark forces, and to start working to undo the damage she believes she caused.
I never realized this while playing through the game as a child, but Zelda deeply blames herself for the downfall of Hyrule.
During Link's slumber, Zelda has had to bear witness to the consequences of her naive actions and live with the guilt she felt. It was her plan to gather the spiritual stones, and she did enable Link to open the Door of Time. But she did all of this because she thought it would prevent Ganondorf from getting to the Triforce.
Instead, her actions directly allowed him to take over the world. Thankfully, Ganondorf is not in full control yet.
The Triforce, which lived in the Sacred Realm, could only be claimed by someone who was pure of heart. Ganondorf's heart was not pure, and so the Triforce split into 3 individual pieces: power, wisdom, and courage, which scattered to find 3 fitting hosts.
Ganondorf kept the Triforce of Power, Zelda got the Triforce of Wisdom, and Link got the Triforce of Courage.
Zelda finishes her explanation by handing Link the light arrows, a sacred item that can pierce the darkness surrounding Ganondorf. As soon as the handoff is done, Ganondorf captures Zelda and taunts Link to hand deliver the Triforce of Courage to the castle, so Ganondorf can put the artifact back together. Why he didn't use his crystal kidnapping magic on Zelda and Link at the same time, I'll never really know.
It honestly would have been a foolproof plan. I think Ganondorf's hubris really led to his downfall here.
Approaching Ganon's castle has been previously impossible, since it is suspended over a lagoon of lava. But with the power of the sages, a rainbow bridge is created that allows Link to storm the castle. Once inside, there are a series of 6 trials that Link must overcome in order to allow the sages to work their powers inside the castle. Each trial is themed around one of the dungeons we've completed, and there's also an additional one themed around Ganon's castle itself.
I'll cover each of the trials in the order we completed the corresponding dungeon. This wasn't the order I completed them in-game though, so forgive any visual inconsistencies.
The forest trial is actually themed around wind, which ties into what I said earlier about the Forest Temple originally being conceptualized as the Wind Temple. Because of this, the trial is more reminiscent of a hoverboot/fan puzzle in the Shadow Temple than anything we saw in the Forest Temple, but the trial is relatively harmless. Earning the reward for the lamest trial, the Fire Trial is a silver ruby puzzle set over a pool of lava. This really doesn't tie into the Fire Temple's mechanics at all, besides the fact that there's some lava in the room, so I think this is the weakest of all the trials. Just like the Forest Trial, the Water Trial also sports a different theme to the dungeon it's based on. Making use of blue fire and red ice puzzles, the Water Trial more closely resembles the Ice Cavern than the Water Temple. I don't have much to say about this trial, but it's not half bad. If you like the Ice Cavern, you'll like the Water Trial. The Shadow Trial makes use of the Lens of Truth and hoverboots to find a path through a long rectangular room. This trial also gives you the final item of the game, the Golden Gauntlets. These gauntlets allow you to toss comically large pillars out of the way, which is useful to access the Light Trial and to get the double defense upgrade from the Fairy's Fountain outside the castle. As far as theming goes, this trial was spot on with mirroring its dungeon, both in aesthetics and gameplay style. Just like the Spirit Temple, the Spirit Trial has you solving puzzles using the Bomb Chew and the Mirror Shield. I really like the Spirit Temple, so getting more of the same action was super appealing to me. This puzzle in particular was really cool because it almost felt like an escape room. You see your objectives in the form of 2 crystal switches, but you need to figure out how to activate them. A spin attack and a bomb chew aren't enough to do it, but I could see someone getting stumped for a while to figure it out.
Well, that is if the game didn't hand you some bomb chew in the very same room.
With the last trial cleared, the central force field around Ganon's main tower is down, and Link can continue his assault on the castle. The music and general pre-final boss ambiance in this part of the game are indescribable. Top that off with some pristine final enemy encounters, and you've got a recipe for a tense final boss fight on the horizon. And these enemy encounters really are perfect.
You've heard me talk about how the best fights in the game are the ones against Lizalfos, Stalfos, and Iron Knuckles. And it's clear the game developers agree, since those are the 3 final big fights you have before you see Ganondorf.
It's like the game is running back its greatest hits to get you ready for the world's highest stakes game of ping pong. In the final boss chamber, Ganondorf is jamming out on the organ while Zelda is stuck suspended in the air above him. Link entering the room causes the 3 pieces of the Triforce to begin reacting, and that's Ganondorf's cue to talk a little bit of smack, then begin fighting Link.
Just like the Phantom Ganon boss fight in the Forest Temple, the real Ganondorf fight is a series of ping-pong matches where the winner gets to deal damage to the loser.
Ganondorf conjures up a ball of energy, and Link has to use a variety of methods to reflect it back. I found the most reliable method was to use an empty bottle, since Link slightly steps forward when swinging his sword, and that alters the timing for longer rallies. Using a bottle, the timing is always the same, so it's easier to get the ball back into Ganondorf's range. When he inevitably misses, you can stun him with a light arrow, then go in and attack with your sword. This fight feels climactic, with Ganondorf always hovering above Link unless he's stunned.
You're literally bringing the King of Evil down to your level to deal damage to him.
And when the fight is over, Ganondorf's pride absolutely implodes. Unable to comprehend how he could be defeated by the child he rode off for years and years, Ganondorf begins the spontaneous demolition of his castle. Link and Zelda have 3 minutes to flee the castle as it collapses.
Combined with the lingering tension from the fight, the thrill of having won, and the pressure of the timer counting down, the game does not let up as you run for the exit.
There's one final Stalfos fight on the way down that tries to stall you as the timer counts down, but after all we've been through, they're light work. Just as the timer approaches 0, Link and Zelda escape and watch Ganondorf's handiwork come crumbling down for the last time.
But that's not the end of the game.
After the dust settles, a rumbling sound emerges from the rubble, and upon inspection, we discover that Ganondorf is still alive, and he's furious. Using the Triforce of Power, Ganondorf transforms into Ganon, a large, pig-like beast with only one thought: destroy. In a fit of rage, Ganon knocks the Master Sword clean out of Link's hand, and the true final fight begins.
The fight against Ganon is absolute cinema. There's no other word for it.
The visuals of Ganon's dark form cast against a storming sky, the music swelling as you realize the terror of the situation, and Link being unarmed as the only weapon capable of defeating the evil entity in front of him is thrown away. Absolute cinema.
From a gameplay perspective, the elegance of this fight shines as well.
Almost every item in your repertoire can be used to stun or damage Ganon.
Every single solitary item you've collected, upgraded, and learned to use throughout your adventure can be used one last time.
As much as this boss is a challenge, it's also a reward. There aren't enough words to accurately convey how empowering this boss fight is.
If anything I've said so far has given you the slightest inkling to want to try Ocarina of Time for the first time, or to replay it, do it.
Do it solely so you can experience this boss fight. From start to finish, the battle against Ganon is perfect. Utterly and completely perfect.
And let's talk about that ending, because the ending is as brutally epic as an N64 game can get.
Beginning a tradition that would be continued in 3D Zelda games, such as The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, Ganon gets gloriously stabbed with the Master Sword to end off the fight. In this game, it's straight into the forehead. With that final press of the B button, Ganon is defeated, and we've completed The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Before the credits roll, Zelda and the sages seal Ganondorf away in the Sacred Realm, and a completely insane Ganondorf vows to wipe out Link and Zelda in a future life. The last scene begins as our two characters meet face to face in a serene skybox. Zelda thanks Link for all he's done, and uses her sage powers to return him to the child timeline for the last time.
It hit me during this conversation just how selfless Link is throughout the game.
When the Decadre first asked for Link to embark on this quest, he literally had nothing to say about it. Zelda expanded the quest for the spiritual stones, then blew the thing wide open with the Ocarina of Time.
And at every turn, Link has stoically carried on.
He's been beaten, bruised, forced to complete the water temple, and battered, but he stands before Zelda asking for nothing at all.
And yeah, I get that he's a silent protagonist, but I really feel the courage flowing out of this character.
No matter the obstacle, Link marches on.
We march on.
But there is no more marching to do. With a final play of Zelda's Lullaby, the credits begin to roll, and the game is officially over. Wow, what an amazing experience.
Throughout my playthrough, I jotted notes down on stickies so I can have an easier time writing the script, and the word I wrote down immediately after completing the game was beautiful.
This game is beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of media. Watching the credits had me feeling really emotional, and I can't quite nail down why. Was I happy to have rebeaten a game I had experienced in my childhood? Was I relieved that I still found the game as magical as I did as a kid? Yes, to both of these things, and to a million more questions. I was happy to have replayed Ocarina of Time, and immediately when I finished the game, I wanted to start playing it over again.
I know that's a cliche thing to say, but I really mean it.
Even with the water temple, the difficulties I had facing Twinrova, and anything else I wasn't jazzed about, I was willing to start replaying the game all over again right away. That's what Ocarina of Time does to me.
Like I said in the beginning, I'm not really sure what the ending of this video is going to look like. If I don't pick something, I'll never end the video, so I'm gonna have to make a choice and stick with it.
Play Ocarina of Time. If you've never played it before, I hope I've convinced you to pick it up. If you've played it already, take some time and play through it again. And really play through it. Don't have it on while you've got a Twitch stream in your ears. Fully focus on the game, read the dialogue, and maybe even get lost chatting with the NPCs. There's so much to discover in Ocarina of Time, both in terms of in-game content and things to interpret between the lines.
The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is the greatest game ever created. I'm confident in saying that. I don't believe it just because of its Metacritic score. I believe that based on what I've seen and what I feel.
The game isn't perfect, but nothing in life is. Ocarina has its highs and lows, but they balance out to a spectacular video game. The game does a lot, but it doesn't try to do too much, and I hope that's clear from this video.
If I don't stop talking now, I literally never will, so I'm gonna cut myself off. Just know that I really truly feel strongly that Ocarina of Time is the greatest game ever made. It's so great that I wanted to add to its legacy with my now completed Hyrule Castle political corruption fanfiction. It starts off slowly, but it ramps up, I promise. Chapter 1. Hot to Go.